Ciao tutti. This is AMC, Digital Assistant Licino Discounty. Thanks for joining us. Today, AMC's William Ford is in conversation with Edward Klorman, musicologist and professor of music theory at the University of Wisconsin, Madison's Mead Witter School of Music, where he joined the faculty in fall 2025. His academic career has included appointments at McGill University, where he held the Canada Research Chair in Musical Analysis and Performance, along with teaching and chamber music coaching at the Juilliard School, the Manhattan School of Music, and Queens College's Copland School of Music. Klorman is the author of Mozart's Music of Friends and Bach, the Cello Suites, a study of how Bach's 6 suites for unaccompanied cello, once regarded as historical curiosities, came to occupy a central place in modern concert life and popular culture. In this conversation, William Ford explores Dr. Klorman's research and his performer-centered approach to musical meaning. And now, here's William in conversation with Edward Klorman.
You're still in Wisconsin, I take it.
Yes, when we spoke the last time, I was at my home office. Now I'm at my work office on campus.
And before we begin, because you are a violist,
Yes.
what's your favorite violist joke?
I know there are a lot of them. I know people enjoy them so much. I don't have a repertoire of them, but you can tell me yours.
I think the one that I used last time, that a violist is a violinist with less personality.
Fair enough.
So how are you?
Doing just fine. Yeah, I'm looking forward to speaking about this again.
Just saw that you had another interview.
This might have been on violinist.com. I shared with them a blog that was the theme was how sort of every generation or every century the cello suites have been reinvented or reshaped in our own image. So in the 19th century, one of the questions was, is this music really appropriate for concerts, or is it more like etudes, or what would it take to bring this music to a different audience? And then more recently, as this music has really taken off in concerts and in recordings, but now also as sort of iconic music that we encounter a lot in pop culture. So people have found different ways of engaging with this music or presenting it from one century to the next.
Because of my interest in helping viewers understand how somebody got to be where they are, let's go back again to where you were born.
I grew up in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York, and I had the good fortune there to have some really excellent music teachers. I started violin and a little bit composition from a very young age. It was around when I entered high school that I switched to viola and began studying music even more seriously. Rochester is hometown to the Eastman School of Music, where I was able to take some really excellent classes in music history and music theory that got me curious, not just about how to play music, but also thinking about how it's put together. So I was really fortunate. I used to go to Eastman in the mornings before I would go to high school, so I was able to take some college courses as a high school student, and I just had wonderful teachers who opened my ears and my imagination.
How did your peers react to your interest in music?
I had a number of classmates in high school who were also very serious about music. Many of us played in youth orchestra together or went to some of the same summer festivals. You know, this was before YouTube, for example, so folks who had sort of a casual interest might not have had as many entry points. Maybe not every kid growing up wants to go to an orchestra concert necessarily. Nowadays, I find people who encounter music through streaming or online might really listen pretty eclectically to a very wide range of kinds of music. So maybe now it's even easier than it used to be to have a kind of casual involvement with classical music too.
And what about your parents? What did they think about your interest in music?
It's certainly something they encouraged. I know a lot of people got into music partly because of encouragement of their parents or their grandparents. My grandmother, who was born in Vienna in 1920, for her music was a very big part of her upbringing. She learned many languages because she was interested in opera, her native language being German and being in Vienna. Schubert art songs were very important to her. She probably knew hundreds of them. So that played a role in my childhood. She would send me books about Mozart, or maybe I remember seeing a video of opera performed by puppets that was for kids, and that was all at her urging. So I sometimes think that some of the values of her upbringing in Vienna, not quite a century before I was born, but a long time before I was born, had some influence in the way I was raised too.
Did she send that material to you because you had expressed an interest in music or just because?
Probably a little of both, I think. Might have been that she sent them to my whole family. My sister was also talented at music and studied trumpet. It might be by virtue of the fact that I was playing violin and viola and studying composition that some of the music I was involved with was a little closer to what my grandmother knew or loved. My parents certainly both grew up with a lot of music around them, including classical music. I think that was quite common for people of their generation, that there was more music in school and was just part of their household.
Well, when I was growing up, which was probably even a little bit before your time, my parents thought that Lawrence Welk was the highest form of culture.
Okay.
Yeah, we never really had the tradition of classical music in my family, but
Yeah.
appreciate what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, sometimes folks who get really deep into study of classical music, there's even a risk of like a kind of a learned snobbery, or this idea that, somebody who's sophisticated will gravitate toward this music, and somebody who isn't, they spend their time with other musics. As I've gone further in my education, I've really had to divest from that way of thinking. So in my work as a musicologist and a music theorist, I have colleagues who work on pop music, on world music, on hip hop, on film music. So really, there's a lot of interesting questions we can ask about many kinds of music. It just happens because of my family background or the lessons I happened to take as a child that sent me on a particular path toward engaging a little more on the classical side.
I think there is still kind of a snobbery, whether it's the people who are listening to classical music or people who are seeing other people who like classical music. One way or another, there's this notion that classical music is elitist, is for the well-educated, the older, and so on. You don't think that's the case anymore?
Oh, I certainly think that's a tradition that has put a strong imprint. And what I'm careful about is, say, if I'm teaching, there might be a piece of music I'm very enthusiastic about. I might find myself on the tip of my tongue about to say, well, this composer was a genius and this is a masterwork. And now I'm a little more careful about that. I don't want to suggest that my preferences have something objective about them, or I'm a little skeptical of the idea that quality, that if this is what you're attached to, that says something about you or the sophistication of your listening, that you gravitate toward this or toward that. I think that's a story sometimes we tell about ourselves, what it means that we have this or that taste, and I'm a little cautious about that.
We also have a European Western snobbery about our music. When we talk about classical music, for example, we're talking about the Western tradition and ignoring all the rest of the world who has their own version of classical music, for example, in India or other South Asian countries, who have a very different tradition than ours and have their own well-established composers that in the West we never learn very much about.
It's interesting. I've studied at many institutions called Department of Music or School of Music, and in general, the center of gravity in each of them has been this particular body of repertoire. Sometimes it's not even just that it's European, it might moreover be specifically Austrian and German. And then it might get you thinking, well, who chose that this music is what we call canonical or worthy of study? I think a lot as an educator. What is it that I'm requiring and what is it that I'm treating as optional or as an elective? And what are the values it says? And sometimes those are kind of inherited priorities that might go a century or further back, and that they're worth interrogating for sure.
But given our history of the way Western music developed, the theory of music, even the notation, given all of that framework, indeed, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms were at the pinnacle of it, Mozart, for example. But that's within that framework.
Yeah. So certainly those are composers who've had an outsized influence because of that history. So, in spending a few years thinking about Bach's cello suites, they are some of the first music of their kind written for that instrument. And it's hard to imagine any music for solo cello written after them that doesn't owe something to them. So we can talk about kind of a historical legacy this music has played. Certainly, almost every cellist alive has interacted with these pieces in some way, often on an almost daily basis over the course of their whole lifetimes, from student years through their professional careers. So that might be another reason to spend time with this music and to probe a little deeper about what it's meant in different generations and different ways we've engaged with it.
Why did you choose the cello suites to
Yeah.
focus on?
Sometimes I feel like they chose me more than I chose them. When I switched to viola around age 13, 14, my teacher said, well, if you're going to play viola, you should play the Bach cello suites. The viola is tuned an octave higher than the cello. If we're going to play unaccompanied Bach, that's a very good starting point for us. So I have that sort of relationship with this music. Well, I probably first encountered it much earlier as a Suzuki violin student. So in some of the early Suzuki method books, there are also movements arranged from the cello suites. What's fascinating about this music to me is how much it can imply, how much of the music is happening in the imagination of a listener or of a musician playing. That is to say, one of the movements is written in the style of a fugue. Fugue, you usually imagine there's many voices at once, all interacting, twisting, and turning, imitating one another. But this is a piece that has very few chords, very few double stops. And so, to the extent that you hear different voices imitating one another, that's really something Bach magically manages to imply, but that you sort of realize in your imagination, because maybe the notes that the cello plays one at a time, you might hear one of them as a bass note and another one as melody and another one as harmony. Or maybe if the bass plays a little fragment of a motive that we heard earlier, in your mind you can imagine the rest of that fragment, the way it would have sounded if you'd written the piece for keyboard or organ. So that for me is a really fascinating aspect of this music. And when you play it, you think about this all the time, consciously or unconsciously. How am I projecting melody and bass? How am I implying harmony, even if I'm playing one note at a time, is a really interesting aspect of this music. Anybody who plays this music encounters a lot of questions about it because there is no definitive score. We don't have a manuscript in Bach's handwriting. So if you go and purchase different editions, the notes will be different. The slurs will be different. So that is what we use to rely on to decide how to do the bowing and the articulation. If you compare this to the violin, the solo violin music by Bach, we have his handwriting. All the editions pretty much show the same thing. So cellists, they have to do a lot of guesswork. There's no hardly any dynamics. There are some ornaments, but there's some debate which of those could be traced back to Bach. Should we play those? Should we add our own? Should we improvise other embellishments? What speed should we play? Should I have a sense what it means to dance a courant if I'm going to play a movement called courant? And does that tell me something about the tempo or the character of the music? So there's a lot around these pieces that you explore as you play them and as you listen to them. And I wanted to try to figure out what's knowable about this and try to dig into that in a book.
So, what's your conclusion on as to the authorship?
That question has to do with a book that was written by an Australian conductor and musicologist named Martin Jarvis about a decade ago, in which he advanced the theory that this music, since there's no autograph manuscript, probably, he says, was written by Bach's second wife, Anna Magdalena Bach. The consensus is very clear that this music is by J.S. Bach. The evidence includes, for example, a list of his works written by his son, C.P.E. Bach, and one of his prize students. They wrote an obituary shortly after he died, listing all of his best-known music, and they singled this out as one of the pieces of note. What Martin Jarvis reads incorrectly, in many of our opinion, is the copy of the cello suites written by Anna Magdalena Bach. It says on the cover in French, écrite, written by Mrs. Bach, but that means written in terms of who's literally doing the handwriting. That's different from composed. So it's pretty clear that this music is by J.S. Bach. I don't think that's a question, in my opinion.
And has anybody done a reliability check on how accurate she was with regard to her transcriptions? No, that's not the
Yes,
right
this is
word,
very
but
interesting. So of the four copyists of the cello suites. There's four surviving manuscript copies. Three of them also copied the sonatas and partitas, the violin music. So for those, it's sort of like a Rosetta Stone. You can compare them against J.S. Bach's handwriting. And a scholar named Andrew Talley, who's a professor at Northwestern University outside Chicago, he has given them scores on how accurate they are in terms of the percentage of their slurs that match J.S. Bach's slurs. The idea being that if one of them is most reliable for slurs in the violin pieces, probably that means the slurs that they wrote in their copy of the cello suites is the most reliable. Anna Magdalena Bach, she was, among other things, she was a very accomplished musician in her own right, a singer, not a professional copyist, and not a professional instrumentalist. The reason she made the copy of the solo violin and solo cello pieces was a commission. So one shouldn't think that she produced this for posterity, for us to have it as our major source. It was a student of Bach's who wanted to have a copy of this music because it wasn't published. And one imagines she was probably doing this late at night when the many children in the household were asleep, maybe by candlelight, maybe not entirely well rested, working quickly to complete the commission. And the reason one gets that impression is there are a number of mistakes. There are some movements that have wrong titles, there are a few wrong notes, there are some places where a measure is copied twice. This gives the impression that she was copying sort of quickly and mechanically, rather than copying and hearing the music in her mind as she copied. And in particular, as regards slurs, many of her slurs, they're not precise about exactly where they begin and end. They're sort of stylized. So because of this, many cellists have said, well, this is as close as we have to an autographed manuscript. They treat this almost like a kind of religious relic, and they've felt that, well, however clear or unclear her slurs are, we have to figure out what they mean, and we have to play exactly what she wrote. The evidence points against that because she's not the most reliable of the copyists of the cello suites. That's the first thing. And secondly, the idea that any musician in the 18th century would have done a kind of microscopic study of exactly what's in this manuscript and memorized it verbatim and performed that. That's probably not the way a musician in Bach's orbit would have played. Musicians enjoyed a lot of freedom to adapt the music to their style, to add ornaments. Many musicians composed to some extent, so that influenced the way that they would have played this music. So in my book, I try to dig through what are some of the arguments people have made and what's the latest thinking on some of these issues.
And then there was question about what instrument the cello suites are actually written for.
Yeah. One might think living today, we know what a cello is. It's a certain size, it has a certain number of strings. You play it between your legs, you hold the bow like this with an overhand bow hold. All of these things were in flux during Bach's lifetime because the cello was a somewhat new instrument. So the old French family of instruments, the viola da gamba, was somewhat in decline, and the cello was very much on the rise, particularly in Italian-speaking lands. In Bologna, in particular, there was a growing school of cello music that included solo cello music. In German-speaking lands, the cello during Bach's lifetime was best known as a bassline instrument. And so often a piece of music might simply say basso, and you could sort of swap in or swap out different kinds of bassline instruments or different combinations of instruments. But the world of instruments people called cello or violoncello, they ranged from instruments that were quite large to instruments that were fairly small that you might place on a kind of a stool or like a box to hold it up, to even an instrument that's called violoncello da spalla. That means shoulder viola, that you would hold like this with a strap around your neck. So some folks have speculated, could that have been the instrument Bach composed this music for? There are folks who've been reviving that instrument. It's a possibility, I'll say at least that. For cellists who held their instrument between their knees, most of them would have used an underhand bow hold. So that's the bow hold that today we associate with the viola da gamba. But there's a lot of evidence that that was the primary bow hold. And I just mention this because for folks who look very closely at the manuscripts and try to do exactly what it says, but they're holding the bow sort of backwards. So if you have this bow hold, the up bow is the strong bow and the down bow is the weaker bow, whereas with the modern overhand bow hold, it's the opposite. So I just want to sound a word of caution about this business of trying to recreate exactly something that they imagined to have been Bach's intentions. It's not clear Bach had a very specific instrument or specific prescription in mind. In fact, Bach adapted a lot of his music for different circumstances. One of the solo violin partitas opens with a movement that he later reused in an orchestral version as sort of like a prelude for one of his cantatas. Cello Suite number 5, he adapted for lute. And when he did that, he transposed it to a different key and he added ornaments, possibly because the lute isn't a sustaining instrument. And so the ornamentation maybe would have enhanced the amount of resonance. So I think Bach, if he were, well, it's a counterfactual to ask what Bach would tell someone to do on a modern cello, but probably it would involve adapting and suiting it to one's personal style. That was the way musicians in the 18th century played. And lastly, I'll just mention cellos could have four strings or five strings. They could have frets. So this idea of what is a cello is a much more flexible and varied conception than we might have today.
The sections of the cello suite are based on dances. How far removed were the dances that informed Bach's writing from the time he was actually writing it?
That's a really interesting and complex question. So the world of dance was very important during Bach's lifetime. Many German courts would have a dance master from Paris, somebody who had trained at Versailles, who would bring not just the dance steps, but the dance music and also other manners, comportment, polite behavior. This was all sort of the role of the dance master. And along with it, the instrumental suite, a suite of dances, was to some extent of French import. Many of these dances had versions that were the French version or the Italian version. And then in German music, we think of a kind of mixed style that draws from each of these. And one would encounter dancing certainly in ballet or in operas that included ballet, functional dancing in ballrooms. But we should also talk about what your question gets at is this issue of like a stylized dance. So if you listen to a Mozart or a Haydn symphony and there's a minuet movement, that's not a minuet intended for dancing. That's a stylized minuet or a piece of music that gestures at the direction or style of minuet. Often, if you tried to dance those, you'd get tripped up because they have the wrong number of measures. And that's part of the fun of that music is how it plays with the conventions of the genre. So by Bach's lifetime, the instrumental suite had coalesced around this specific order of dances. So often there would be a prelude, then the dances would be the allemande, the courante, the sarabande, and the gigue. And then what many composers did and what Bach did in the cello suites is in between the sarabande and gigue, so in the second to last position, he put these more modern dances. These were dances that were more up to date, that were still current, and he did them in pairs. So the first two Bach cello suites have two minuets each, minuet one, minuet two. The next two have pairs of bourrées, and then the last two have pairs of gavottes. These were called galanteries, reflecting that during Bach's lifetime, which was sort of the transition from Baroque to the galant style, these were ones that were considered modern or up to date. Whereas a dance like the allemande had been out of date for almost a century by the time Bach was composing his instrumental allemande. So it was by then more of a stylized genre.
If I sit down and listen to the suites, does it matter whether I know the dances?
I think if you listen to instrumental suites by Bach or one of his contemporaries, you'll certainly get to know the characters of the different dance types. Whether you know the steps is a different question. There are folks whose answer would be absolutely yes. And there are other folks who'd say you can really understand these as instrumental genres. So certainly, I mean, the saraband, which has a sort of a proud quality, it has this quality. It's in a moderately slow three tempo, and it often has an emphasis on beat two. There's often long notes. If you listen to many sarabands, that's something you'll notice, whether you notice it consciously or not. As you go from a saraband to a gigue is lively. It's written in 3/8 or 12/8, so you can certainly feel the quality of gigue as like a finale that wraps the piece up together for sure. Somebody who knows a lot of these pieces in detail will recognize, for instance, Cello Suite number 5 is the most French of the cello suites. So if you know dance pieces by Couperin or by Rameau or by Lully, you'll recognize some of the rhythms will remind you of those French pieces. So over the course of the six suites, Bach wants to give a sense of what are the different kinds of styles, what are the different kinds of instrumental techniques, what are the different ways of interpreting these dance pieces. So the six make up a set that you could think of as like an encyclopedic survey of what's possible in this genre with this instrument.
I know that performance of any piece is influenced by what's going around you today. For example, we hear a lot of Baroque music played by symphony orchestras, and I think, as I mentioned last time, they sound to me like it's Bach by way of Rachmaninoff.
Uh-huh.
And yet I know there has to be flexibility and responsiveness to the kinds of things that people like to hear today. But also, there's that whole school that says we should do historically informed performances with period instruments and so on. How do you view that with regard to the cello suites?
This is a very difficult issue for any repertoire, any historical repertoire. In my training, I was first trained as a modern violist, and I later studied Baroque performance. There was a period where I really gravitated toward the Baroque playing because for me it was refreshing that it offered so many different kinds of sounds or different kinds of ways to be expressive. In particular, many modern players are trained that the expression comes mostly from vibrato, and the bow is supposed to basically be sustained. And so it was a revelation for me when one relaxed or reduced the vibrato, the kinds of shapes you could make with the bow, or the idea that the bow bottom, 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 bottom could there could be gaps between the sound, or the sound could have like a spoken quality that maybe resembles dancing more than the more sustained way that I had been trained. My own feeling is I think we're really fortunate that there's so many possibilities. With the cello suites, there are at least 300 recordings you could listen to of the complete suites. Some musicians have recorded them two, three, or four times. So there's really a lot to choose from. We're really spoiled for choice. So if you find yourself gravitating toward the historical approach, there's many, many different kinds of ways people have done that. That includes on historical cellos of different kinds with different kinds of bow technique, also on instruments like viola da gamba, on harpsichord, on Baroque flute. If that's what you prefer, there's a lot out there to listen to. If you find yourself attracted to the more sustained or the more romanticized, you might call it, versions, there's also a lot to choose from there. So I think we're really spoiled for choice.
If you were to take out your viola now and play, how would you play it?
It's true if you pin me down that my own playing is colored and influenced a lot by the historical performance movement. So I spent a lot of time reading, books from the 18th century and trying to imagine how musicians at that time thought about an expressive performance. But even within that world, there's lots of questions. How much should we be adding ornaments, and of which kind? If I read books that give me a sense how Bach might have composed this music, sometimes they invite you as you play the music to approach it with a certain freedom, to add things, to subtract things, to change things. Even if I'm playing in a historically informed approach, whatever that might mean, first of all, the idea of what that is something that's constantly changing too. So 10, 20 years from now, people will look at historical recordings from right now and say, oh, well, they were so misguided with that. As it should be. The idea, though, that then I would play all six movements of a suite in order, that's something that probably wasn't done very much in the 18th century. So the idea that you could leave movements out or swap movements around from different pieces, the idea even that you'd play this music in a concert, for all we know, I mean, one of the uses of this music or the design of the cello suites as a collection is for a musician to learn about music making and learn about their instrument in the same way that if you play the well-tempered clavier, you learn to play in every key. You develop technique to play fugues. You learn different styles of preludes. You maybe get a sense how you would improvise a prelude because you have all these pieces by Bach as a model. So they're pieces that are at least as much for a musician to educate themselves and as sort of exemplars, almost like a kind of a textbook without words, with just the examples. The cello suites you could think of that way. So the idea that you'd go to a concert and hear all six of them in order with every movement played, with all the repeats, that's probably not itself an 18th century practice, although it's how I've grown accustomed to hearing this music. So that's something very much of our time as well.
Do you have any recordings that you find particularly attractive that you're drawn to?
There are so many. Um, in part of my research for the book, I listened to some quite old recordings, including some recordings that predate Pablo Casal's world premiere recording of the complete set from the late 1930s. So there are recordings, for instance, from the 1920s of the cello suite of certain movements played with piano accompaniment. And if you listen to it, you might not even recognize it as sounding like Bach. The melody is played in a bel canto way, very sustained. The piano accompaniment, to me, doesn't sound like something Bach would have written. But it's fascinating for me to get a sense of how audiences around the turn of the 20th century or the early decades of the 20th century, what they imagine when they played this music. So that for me has been very eye-opening as I try to imagine, if I look at editions that come from the 1870s, 1880s, I can imagine what those performances sounded like. But we have some recordings from the early decades of the 20th century that are on YouTube. So for me, those are very eye-opening. Certainly, Pablo Casals is a very inspiring figure who has been tremendously influential. Many of my teachers studied in one way or another with Casals or with people who worked with Casals or with students of Casals. I don't myself play in a way that sounds very much like those recordings, but that was interesting for me to contextualize some of my own training and some of the music making I hear around me. The Dutch cellist, the late Honor Bilsma, that was the first performance I ever heard on a Baroque cello, and certainly that opened a whole new world of possibilities for me. But there is so much out there. I'm really just beginning to scratch the surface. There are more recent recordings that approach these pieces in different ways. There's also been a lot of experimentation with how to perform the cello suites, people performing them, for instance, interspersed with commissioned works in different styles as a way of shining new lights on them. There have been many modern dance choreographies made with the cello suites, and so that's another way people present these is combining with other art forms, whether it's dance or well, Yo-Yo Ma has a series of videos called Inspired by Bach from the late 1990s. Each one of them pairs the cello suites with a different genre, whether it's drama or kabuki acting or ice dancing. So that people have been very inventive with the different kinds of ways we can present these pieces.
When you sat down to write your analysis, who were you writing it for?
Yeah. My book, Bach, the Cello Suites, is part of a series called the New Cambridge Music Handbooks. And so I was thinking a little bit about the aim of that series is to be for many kinds of readers. So folks who maybe own an album of the Cello Suites or have heard them in concert once or twice, this is a book that would be readable by them. If you read music, you'll be able to follow every word. If you don't read music, that's okay. You'll be able to follow maybe 85% of the book. But then for people who play this music, so that's a lot of cellists, violists, but also, trombonists, bassoonists, marimba players. This is music that has touched many people. I tried to dig into things you might have heard from different teachers. So maybe you have one teacher who says, well, it must be separate, and another who says it must be slurred. Another says it must be this tempo. Another, what? Why that tempo? I've wanted to try to put a reader in a position that they could think about, well, how do we know what we know? And how have different ideas about this music changed from one generation to another? I think their book will have some surprises for different readers. The idea, many people might read, for instance, on Wikipedia that this music basically wasn't known until the 1920s, 1930s, when Pablo Casals began performing them so extensively. I've been able to show many performances from starting from around the 1860s. I find that from reading reviews of their concerts. I knew I would find some of that, but I didn't expect to find as much as I did, and as wide a geographical region. So certainly Germany, France, England, but even as far away as Australia, there were performances of the Bach cello suites. There were performances in the 1860s and 70s on instruments besides cello. So there were well-reviewed performances in violin transcription. There were many versions for solo piano. There was a version made for cello and piano, and the person who made that version, he performed it in a series he ran with trombone and organ, with viola and organ. So that's just been very interesting for me to see what a variety and how much creativity people have brought, a very flexible conception of what kinds of ways one could approach this music and what it could sound like.
It is interesting that music that's roughly 300 years old still is so resonant and has infiltrated the popular culture, as you mentioned before. Why do you think that is? What is it about the music that makes it still a big deal even today?
Yeah. Well, Bach has an outsized role in the way we think about the history of classical music. So certainly there's this idea of Bach as one of the earliest composers that many people engage with, or might be foundational to other composers who came after. So if you love Bach and if you play the cello, this is really the body of music that you have to invest with and live a lifetime with. Maybe the abstraction of this music means it can be adapted really endlessly. A good example of that would be the prelude to the first cello suite. It's sort of like the cello version of what the C major prelude on keyboard from the Well-Tempered Clavier is. It's a series of arpeggios that open up a range of harmonies and get the cello ringing with its open strings. This music has been used, for example, in commercials ranging from diamonds to pizza to lazy boy furniture. It's been used in the film Master and Commander, where the undulation of the arpeggios represents the ocean. But it's also been used in a vampire horror thriller in which David Bowie plays a cellist vampire who's about 300 years old. And so David Bowie learned to play this for that. Many series on Netflix have used aspects of the cello suites, but also if we think globally, so there are anime series made in Japan that have the cello suites. I think it has something to do with their abstraction, maybe something about the cello and the deepness of its sound, or that the shape and size of a cello represent maybe resembles a human body. The cello suites have been used a lot in humanitarian advocacy. I think that's partly Casals' legacy. So there are examples like Rostropovich playing them at the fall of the Berlin Wall. More recently, Yo-Yo Ma playing them at the US-Mexico border or in protest outside the Russian embassy. There was a viral video made a few years ago in the streets of Kharkiv, just after that city had been destroyed in bombardment, that went viral. So this music takes on different meanings and resonances based on what we project onto it and where we're playing it and what symbols we attach to it.
It seems like Yo-Yo Ma's almost made a career out of it.
He's lived with this piece throughout a lifetime. I think he's completed his third recording, what he says will be his final complete recording. I think Yo-Yo Ma has spent the second half of his career thinking a lot about how music can connect different kinds of people, including
Hmm.
across cultures. That also may be a legacy influenced by Casals, who was an important figure for him and who thought about music making as a form of humanitarianism. So for his third recording of the cello suites, Yo-Yo Ma did a tour to 36 cities, since there's 36 movements, across 6 continents. And each of his concerts were connected to days of action, is what he called them, which involved connecting with communities, community musicians, bringing music outside the concert hall. That's something that's probably a little easier to do with a cello than with, say, a piano or a symphony orchestra to bring it to
Right.
a special location. So, ways people have used the cello suites as a catalyst for community building, connecting with people, bringing the concert hall to people instead of people to the concert hall. That's certainly a big part of how we've come to think about these pieces.
Fascinating, wonderful, wonderful analysis.
It's a real pleasure to speak with you and to spend some time with these fantastic pieces. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.
All right, you take care
Have a
now.
great day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
And that brings us to the end of our conversation with Edward Klorman. Edward, thank you for joining us, and for the depth you bring to everything you do, your erudition, your scholarship, and, above all, your evident love for the music itself. And thank you, William, for guiding the conversation. One of the most striking takeaways from this conversation is how music that's 200 years old can still feel alive, still find new audiences, and still generate new contemporary meaning. The notes haven't changed, but we have, and the dialogue between past and present keeps evolving. And here's a thought: if scholars can learn so much from the letters, additions, and performance traditions of earlier centuries, maybe 300 years from now someone will be studying our own time, and turning to interviews like these to better understand today's musicians, composers, and conductors. You can help them do theater work better by liking and subscribing to help get the word out about Atlanta Music Critic. For more interviews, essays, and analysis, visit w4.substack.com. And if you'd like to support Atlanta Music Critic directly, you can do so at patreon.com/Atlanta Music Critic. And a special thank you to Gail Ween at classicalmusiccommunications.com for facilitating this conversation. Thanks also to composer Lorenzo Carano for letting us use his electronic realization of Bach's Cello Suite 1 Prelude. Until next time, this is Luchino Discounti, for Atlanta Music Critic.